All right, welcome to Lookout. Today is September 2nd. We're going to talk about the Dixie Fire. I know I've been talking about the Caldor on all these videos, and I don't want all my people up in Plumas to feel left out from the YouTube revolution. So here we're coming in to talk about Dixie Fire. Dixie's just filling in the gaps, burning everything that's not burned yet. Here's a map showing some fire history. This kind of stuff that we think about a lot as firefighters, because when these fires get large, past fires on the landscape really affect how they spread. They buy us advantages. There are places we don't have to worry about burning again sometimes. Anyway, here's Dixie. Dixie, the big story for the last 4 or 5 days is that it's made a huge run out to the southeast side of the fire. And so as of last night at 8 p.m., the fire was kind of knocking on the door of Highway 395. This is an area that was evacuated earlier in the summer in July when the Beckworth fire burned. Beckworth fire started over here in Sierra Valley and came over the hill towards Doyle, burned up a lot of structures. People in Milford were evacuated. People in Milford were evacuated again when the Dixie Fire came over the hill here and burned down in Janesville, burned towards Milford. Anyway, now they're getting it again from the south. And so Dixie just keeps giving. Anyway, this fire has made some huge runs in the last couple of days with our strong kind of red flag warning kind of south winds. So kind of the good part of the story of Dixie right now is just that those southwest winds took it away from Quincy. So most of the people in Plumas County live along the Highway 70 corridor here in Quincy, Spring Garden, Greenhorn. These towns, Massac and Spring Garden, I don't even know if I've ever seen Massac. I always try to figure out where it is. Some of these towns are just that show up on the map are old, railroad sidings, but it's a landmark. The purple is last year's Bear Fire, North Complex. Anyway, when you look at the Bear and the Dixie and the Beckworth and all these other fires, we've burned up most of the Plumas National Forest in the last 10 years. Pretty gnarly. Anyway, on this, sorry. Good news here is just that they've held the fire on Grizzly Ridge, kept it out of Quincy and Greenhorn and all these other places, so that's a good thing. The bad thing is just that fire in the meantime is eating up a lot of what's left of the forest on the east side of the forest. I've had some questions, and there's been some questions in general about how the firing of this ridge affected the spread and why we had to fire it when we did. Talked to a friend this morning who's been right out in the middle of all this. Guy with a ton of experience I respect a lot. He said that so the fire, when the wind started, the fire was kind of pushing here towards the Walker Fire. He said pretty much they have fired along this ridge, but that a lot of the fire spread, they've been firing mainly to keep up with the spread of the fire as it's gone away from here. And really that what has pushed them to having to do it now, everyone knows it's not the best time to be putting fire on the ridge, but just that we're forecast to come back to north winds after these southwest winds are done. And the concern is definitely that if we don't button up this ridge, we're going to lose the fire into these areas here in the 70 corridor. So it just illustrates these really tough calls that have to get made when we have these big fires going. I mean, there's a lot we can tease out about how things have gone down. It's really taboo to question firefighting tactics of the teams. I've tried really hard not to do that. I think my pain at watching this whole rest of the east side burn, the kind of anger at that, has had me questioning why we're doing the things we are. And I think it's fair to ask questions about why we're fighting fire the way we are. Without signing blame or assuming that people are idiots and doing stupid things, acknowledging that there are huge pressures to keep the fire out of communities. I think, one thing we need to talk about going forward is just well, are we willing to burn 100 acres? I mean, are we willing to burn 10,000 acres, to save one house? Are we willing to let 100,000 acres burn to save 100 houses? There's a lot of assumptions that are in our culture and in our, the way we fight fires, that I think it's fair for us to have this public conversation about, because, the politics of losing homes is fraught. The politics of losing 100 square miles of timber is fraught. This is a county that's survived on a timber economy for the last 100 years. And, these fires, when you look at how much of the area, within 50 miles of Quincy is burned, it's generational impacts now on the local economies, et cetera. And so, and in the backdrop of all that is fire that really doesn't care about our politics or our economic systems or anything else. Anyway, the stuff that we're going to dig into in the lookout, we want to bring up this stuff in a way that doesn't blame and it doesn't shame and doesn't just talk a bunch of trash unnecessarily. The facts on the ground are what they are, and this fire is just doing what it wants. Anyway, that's what's going on here. Is as of 8:30 last night, it wasn't 395 yet. I don't know where it is now. We don't have any mapping since then. It's going to keep moving, obviously. When we talk about this fire running 20 miles, what we need to keep in mind from a firefighting perspective is that that's 20 miles long, but that's 20 miles of flank here. It's 20 miles of flank here. It's another 15 miles of flank here, another maybe 5 or 10. So, a 20-mile run can open up 50 miles of fire perimeter. We don't have resources to put in 50 miles of fire line, in 2 days. So that's why these fires keep spreading. And when we say that we're outpaced by the fire, that's what we're talking about, is that just the fire moves way faster than even 2,000 firefighters can keep up with it. Elsewhere on the fire, we've been watching this area up here. So just to jump around real quick, here's Westwood and Lake Almanor. You go up 821, the county road north of Westwood, black stozer lines. This has all been holding. Up here around Silver Lake, the Caribou Wilderness is this area here in the middle that's kind of green, and Lassen Park is in purple behind it. North of Silver Lake is the 10 road, and the 10 road goes around and comes back out to Bogard Ranger Station. And there's other major roads that go all the way around the north end of the park, Lassen Park, and Caribou to Butte Lake. And those have been fired over the past a couple weeks to keep the fire that's been burning inside of the park and Caribou contained when it comes out. We had a slop over up here. This got fired a week and a half ago, immediately jumped the line and burned out into this area. And some really good firefighting kept it from crossing Highway 44. For the most part, kept it out of this private, these clear cuts here on private timberlands. Fire continues to spread inside the park. One thing that's interesting on this part of the fire is just that, and we talked about this a lot earlier in the fire, is that this is the 2012 Reading fire in Lassen Park. This started as what we call a prescribed natural fire, where there was a lightning fire and the Park Service decided to let it burn for resource benefits. Lassen Park's done a lot of this over the last 30 years, and it's been controversial. This fire left the park onto the National Forest, burned some private timberland, and it was this huge kind of fiasco at the time. Congressional requests for investigations, big kind of, it was a big black eye for using fire on the landscape. And just like what we've seen on the Caples fire, which has kind of given us an advantage in fighting the Caldor fire, this the fire here has burned into the Reading fire, and it really has barely moved into the Reading fire footprint over the past 2 weeks. So really what that has bought us as an advantage is we didn't have the resources to be fighting this whole fire at once. We were busy at the time, 2 weeks ago, we were busy trying to save Westwood, trying to save Susanville, trying to save Janesville. So this 2012 Reading fire, being full of a bunch of 9-year-old brush and with huge fuel reduction from less burn, has held up the fire here. Without that, we've seen some big pushes of winds that have blown fire out of the park. This fire could have burned out towards the old station and been in a position where our north winds are going to carry it down, into all this private timberland around Shingletown, down here. So the past prescribed fire or the fire that we let burn, it became a wildfire. There was a black eye, really has kind of saved the bacon on this whole side of the fire. So that's another story worth telling out of this that we're going to keep watching. Anyway, coming back to here by Bogard, we had an escape here on the firing operations on the 10 road. This was, starting about a week ago. We had spotting on this. It took off and became a new part of its own fire. It's kind of its own whole story, and I talk about it on the lookout. There's a post about firing operations on the Dixie Fire. We've had a lot of success with firing operations on the Dixie Fire, and we go into that in detail in this post. Just that it's one of the only tools we have to control big landscape fires, landscape scale fires like this. But it's also it brings with it a lot of risk because we're putting fire on the ground during a time that we know we have really extreme potential for fire spread. So I'm going to pull up a little piece here. This is a little progression of the firing on the 10 road. This is on the 29th of August. And we can see that the main fire is up inside the park, still up inside Caribou Wilderness. And the main fire up here has really just been kind of skunking around for the past month in the high country because this is up, around 7,000 feet elevation or higher. So a lot of our higher elevation fires often don't spread very fast. The fuel is all packed down kind of under a glacier of snow for 6 months out of the year. Anyway, firing got started here, probably the night of the 28th. By 2 o'clock, the fire had started to spot across the road. And by that night, we had a couple hundred acres that were over the line. The next day, we started to get these on the 30th. We were getting some strong southwest winds, and the fire really blew out. What happened at the same time is the fire inside the wilderness area also blew out. And that's the reason that this fire, it's easy to say, well, how come they were firing when they knew there was going to be a red flag warning? They were firing because they knew that this fire was going to come out of there, and they had kind of this real pressure, sense of urgency to get this fired before the fire got there. So the thing is just that with the timing of when we were able to get fire on the ground, there wasn't enough fire on the ground to contain this run. And the run that had already been lit and escaped the day before kind of had a one-day head start. So when you think of these wind events, the wind events are kind of a window of opportunity for fire to spread. And so because we put a bunch of fire on the ground before the wind event, we kind of gave the fire a one-day head start, where this fire, it was, if you get a 4-mile spread in a day, now we've got, an extra couple thousand acres of fire that were exposed to those winds. It just illustrates that we've got real difficulty in our capacity, and things like this happen because, in part, something like the Caldor fire gets started, and we have to pull a bunch of resources from one fire that's not threatening 100,000 people's homes off to a fire that's higher priority. And firefighters can only work with what they've got. So, once we put fire on the ground, we're committed to holding that fire. And then things happen like the Caldor, and suddenly you don't get the aircraft that you thought you might have to support your burnout, etc. And the timing of these things really unfolds on a much larger scale, in that the reason that we don't have containment on this part of the fire is because, as it was threatening really no towns, the priority on the Dixie for weeks has been to save the towns. And this area of the fire has been a lower priority. So just as another illustration of how this landscape, when you've got a 1 million acre fire, it gets to do what it wants. It works on a scale that kind of exceeds our capacity to deal with it. Anyway, that's about all that we've got right now for the Dixie. One other thing that came up yesterday is we're going to come down here by Taylorsville in Genesee Valley. And here, this is where the fire crossed. The fire crossed at Genesee Valley and headed south a little over a week ago. and that's become this new part of the fire that's the most active. But what we've got here is we've got this kind of uncontained amount of fire here above on Grizzly Peak, north or south of the Genesee Taylorsville Road. Firefighters hate uncontained fire. They hate it being open here, and there's a good reason for that. I mean, if we get strong north winds and we've got active fire here, a lot of the fires on these this is incredibly steep alpine country. This is kind of like the Switzerland of Northern California, where the valley's at 3,500 feet. The peak here is at 7,500 feet. I grew up in this area, and I only know a couple people that have ever even walked on this mountain. It's so steep and hard to get in and out of. Anyway, there's a desire here to kind of tie this off. And so that's one of the challenges right now for the fire team, is to figure out how they'd like to connect this back to this area that burned. We can talk all day about, how that's going to work out on the ground, or, what the hazards are of that. But the fact is that firefighters hate having uncontained fire line, especially to have it north of a major town heading into the north wind season. So they've got their work cut out there for them. Taylorsville's been through so much. Indian Valley has been through so much. What's crazy about the Dixie Fire is really that, it started down here. It burned north. But then when it got here to Indian Valley, it's basically, we put it out over here 5 weeks ago, but it's basically burned all the way around Indian Valley, burned over towards Janesville, burned back down to Genesee Valley, and now it's burned out the other direction. So it's just Dixie Fire is on this leisurely tour that's basically centered on Taylorsville, and Taylorsville's still in it. So we'll see what unfolds here. There's plenty of kind of drama to be had in this story. The terrain definitely doesn't do any favors here for the firefighters. Mount Huff over here in Grizzly Peak, it is really wild alpine country. And so we'll see how it unfolds. We'll be watching it. So that's it for your Dixie Fire tour. We'll keep you posted, see what's happening here. Thanks for supporting the Lookout, and keep checking back on updates here.